Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on History Vibe podcast. Today, I'm joined by Professor Joel Baden. Joel Baden earned his Bachelor's of Arts from Yale University in 1999 in Judaic Studies, and then his Master's of Arts at the University of Chicago in 2002 in Northwest Semitics, and a PhD in the Hebrew Bible from Harvard University in 2007. Professor Joel Baden works widely in the field of Hebrew Bible with special attention to the literary history of the Pentateuch. He is the author, most recently, of the Book of Exodus, a biography, Princeton University Press 2019. His other books include J.E. and the Redaction of the Pentateuch, published with Morris Zebek 2009, The Composition of the Pentateuch, Renewing the Documentary Hypothesis, Yale University Press 2012, The Promise to the Patriarchs, published in Oxford University Press 2013, The Historical David, the Real Life of an Invented Hero, published in Harper 1 in 2013, Reconceiving Infertility, Biblical Perspectives on Procreation and Childlessness with Canada Moss, published in Princeton University Press 2015, and Bible Nation, the United States of Hobby Lobby with Canada Moss, again published in Princeton University Press 2017. He is the co-editor of the volumes The Strata of the Priestly Writings, Contemporary Debate and Future Directions, published in TVC 2009, Symbols, Scriptures, and Scrolls, published in Brill 2017, and the Oxford Handbook of the Pentateuch, published in Oxford University Press 2021. Professor Baden has also published numerous scholarly articles and essays, and he has also written widely for a popular audience in venues such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic Monthly, Slate, the Los Angeles Times, Politico, CNN, and the Daily Beast. Current projects he's working on include editing the Rutledge Handbook of Marginalization in the Bible and a special issue of the Journal of Religions, devoted to the Hebrew Bible, race, and racism, along with writing forthcoming commentaries on Deuteronomy, Exodus, and Limitations. So welcome to History Valley Podcast, Professor Joel Baden.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for joining me today. So, did Moses write the Torah?
What do you think?
Well, it doesn't look like it to me, but I would like to know what you think.
No. And that's not like it's not a controversial opinion, certainly not in scholarship. In fact, Moses being the author of the Torah goes back, as a belief for a couple of thousand years, probably, stated most prominently in the Talmud. Moses wrote his book. Uh, uh, but even by the medieval period, Jewish scholars were like, maybe not the whole thing. And by the 17th, 16th, even 17th century, lots of scholars were like, no, for sure not. Just because there's anachronisms, things that Moses couldn't have known, things Moses couldn't have said, beyond things just like, Moses died. Sentences like, the very beginning of Deuteronomy is the classic one that it says, on the other side of the Jordan, Moses gave this speech. It's like the other side of the Jordan. Other side of the Jordan from what? And which means it had to have been written by somebody who was standing on the Israel side of the Jordan, rather than the Moab side where Moses was. Anyway, clear enough for people for a few hundred years at least that Moses probably didn't do the writing of the Torah, but more than that, pretty evident, and this is where my work comes in, I suppose. Pretty evident that no one person could have written this, because it's just, I don't know. You ever try reading the thing? It's kind of messy, messy in a way that doesn't suggest a single person was responsible for it.
So, when the ancient Jewish writers that were aware of this problem with going through the Torah, how much of it did they see as problematic? Were their views of it similar to the views of today, like scholars such as yourself view the Torah? So, coherency as being an issue here, or did they not think it was as bad as current scholarship does?
So it's a question that it's got two parts, right? They recognized all the same stuff, probably more. But they certainly recognized absolutely everything that we see as problematic, right? We see doublets, they saw the doublets. We see contradictions, they saw the contradictions. We see gaps, they saw the gaps. All these kinds of incoherencies and discontinuities, they were totally aware of them, which is to say, we're not making them up today. But the ancient rabbis absolutely knew that that's what was in the text. But they also, came to the text with the presumption that it was divine and perfect and triptych, and that all of these things were there in order to teach us something. And the other difference is, so part of it is that assumption, right, which is right pre-enlightenment versus post-enlightenment in some sense. But also, it's like um, it's not just the assumption about what the text is. It's also it's a reading practice question, right? The ancient Jewish readers, for the most part, didn't read for like coherent narrative. If you pick up, Jewish interpretive texts really from almost anywhere in the first millennium, what you'll see is them working on a verse by verse basis, right? So they take a verse and then they connect it with some other verse somewhere else. But it's the verse that's the conceptual unit they're playing with. Um, and it's not really until like the medieval period with, the rise of newer, different forms of interpretation, like shot and things like that come about in, with Rashbam and others that follow, um, that you get people reading like for coherent narrative. Um, and that's where we're still in the reading for coherent narrative stage.
What is the documentary hypothesis?
Documentary hypothesis is a theory that came about in the mid 19th century among scholars, basically in Germany. Um, as scholars started grappling with the problems of the Torah and its contradictions and all of these things, a variety of suggestions were put forward as to how to explain any of this. Um, Maybe it was just a bunch of little pieces that had been put together, so like fragments that were all sort of smushed together. A creation story in Genesis 1, a Garden of Eden story in Genesis 2, a story about Cain and Abel in Genesis 4, right? Like a flood story in Genesis. Like these were all maybe little individual things. Somebody sort of put them all together, compiled them. Um, and that was known as like the fragmentary process. The whole thing was then fragments, or maybe it was like somebody had written one thing, and then it was like people added layers to it, and then that became like the supplementary hypothesis, the documentary hypothesis, which arose, as like I said, really most prominently in the mid 19th century, suggested that in fact what we were looking at here was a Torah that was made up of four in once independent documents, so texts of their own, that had then been interwoven with each other. And that's the hypothesis, right? And it's important to emphasize, right, the document part I just explained, right, the four documents. The hypothesis part is important too, because it reminds us, right, that word reminds us that what we've got here is like not a uh, not like a conclusion necessarily, not really science, but an attempt to explain the phenomena that we see in the text, right? Why does the Torah look the way it does? Well, this is the best explanation that we've got. So says the hypothesis, right? It's an explanation for what we see in the Torah itself, not something that we brought to it. Like nobody walked in and said, "Hey, I'm going to look for four sources here." Uh, it was like, "What's going on here?" Oh, I think maybe the answer is four sources.
How confident are scholars that these hypothetical sources existed?
Depends who you ask. Uh, if you ask me, pretty confident. Uh, yeah, there's very few things in the world of biblical scholarship. I probably this is true of all scholarship that everybody agrees, and this is not one of them. But there are, I mean, we're a couple of hundred years deep into this idea, these documents, in this documentary hypothesis, and these sources. So, in the broad sweep of scholarship, it sure looks like lots of people are thinking about using these sources as a way of understanding how the text came to be, and then of understanding other things like the history of religion, maybe just the history of Israel generally. But there are scholars out there for sure who are less certain. There are elements of the theory that are pretty much accepted by just about everybody. That is, there's nobody out there arguing for like unified Mosaic authorship anymore. So everybody, absolutely everybody who's talking about the Torah in biblical scholarship is talking about multiple hands of one sort or another. What those multiple hands looked like, were they independent sources, as I suggest? Were they smaller pieces? Are they layers? There's all sorts of varieties of ways that you can have multiple hands present in a text and have them put together. Everybody basically agrees on things like most of Deuteronomy is one layer or one source. There's an enormous chunk of the Torah that is what we call priestly, right? That comprises basically all of Leviticus and goes back to Genesis 1. And most scholars agree on which texts belong to the priestly portions of the Pentateuch, of the Torah. And then there's more disagreement about the other stuff.
When do these various sources date?
I don't know that we have a good answer to that. It's the question everybody wants to answer to, right? Everyone wants to know when, which is itself, in a way, sort of fascinating to me that people are really like hung up on when they come from, or even who wrote them, which I suppose we're going to get to. But it's a little hard to it's a hard question to answer for a bunch of reasons. First, unlike say other texts of the Bible, like I don't know, Kings or the prophetic texts, where like you kind of know when they were written because they refer to historical events that we can date. Um, uh, so whatever, any prophetic text you pick up and it says, so and so prophesied in the reign of. Okay, so like now I know basically when it was. Or Isaiah alludes to Cyrus, and you're like, okay, well, must be after Cyrus. The problem with the Pentateuch is it's entirely about stuff that happened in Israel's essentially like prehistory, right? Like everything from creation to the death of Moses exists kind of in the mythic past. There's no and they're not interweaving into those stories a lot of sort of present day references. There's no like nobody refers to Cyrus in the middle of the Torah, right? So like we lose a lot of the sort of dating clues that we might otherwise hope for. So on that front, it's just hard to do generally. So how do you go about dating texts? Well, I mean, first of all, you start looking for those kinds of clues. Okay, they don't exist. You start looking for things like linguistic style, right? Like Hebrew, like every language, changes over time. So in the same way that I can tell like Chaucer's English from Shakespeare's English from my English, you can do that with Hebrew in the Bible also. Problem there is the whole Torah basically reads like it's the same style of Hebrew, which is to say, on the earlier side rather than the later side of the sort of biblical period. If we think about the Bible's ranging from about 1,000 to 200 BCE, so in the earlier half of that, probably. But there's not a lot more we can do with that. And then we find ourselves with the like even more pressing problem, at least to my mind, which is all of these documents and sources show plenty of evidence having been reworked over time, right? So, there are multiple, even if I talk about like the priestly source, the priestly document, I can easily identify at least 3 distinct layers or editions of that, right? Like somebody wrote one part and then somebody put more into it, and then somebody put more on top of that. So when I ask about the date of any of these documents, assuming they all are sort of like that, when we talk about the dating of any one of these documents, which date do I mean? Do I mean the date when I think somebody first like set pen to papyrus and was like, let me start thinking about like I'll write the first chapter of the thing? Are we talking about the very last person who wrote right? The last person who said, "All right, I think we're finished with this thing now." That is to say, something like the priestly document might well have a compositional range within it, even within itself, of hundreds of years, from its earliest writing to its latest like layer or editing. So what do I mean? How do I date a text, right? I think they all basically start sometime in what we call the pre-exilic period, right? Sometime before 600, and in most cases earlier than that. Yeah, Deuteronomy is probably mid 7th century, and what we call the J and E sources are probably from before that, and the priestly source could be from kind of anywhere in there. And then they all kept on being written and edited, I think, right down probably to the moment that they were put together into one text. So in something like the 5th or 4th century. So when do we date? I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question. I don't know how to answer that question. But like, it's not 1,000 BC, and it's not 100 BC, and it's somewhere in
How do scholars discern the layers within E, P, J, and D?
between. Okay, good. That was a fine follow-up question. I'm going to teed you up for that one. So whereas separating a source from another one is, I don't know if I say easy, but at least reasonably straightforward. Is I can tell when there's two different sources because they're telling two different stories. Even if they're telling the same like basic story, they're telling it differently enough. Right? So it's really easy to see, I think, that the creation story in Genesis 1 and the creation story in Genesis 2 are not by the same author because they've got completely different orders of creation and assumptions and places. The whole thing, like they can conflict with each other just about every basic like element of plot or detail, like story. Um, when you're talking then about layers within a source, so it's not that straightforward, right? If it were if a layer were contradictory in that same kind of like basic plot story kind of way, it wouldn't be a layer, it would be a different source. So, one of the ways that we say that this is probably a layer is, like this assumes and builds on the plot and story of what I already know. But then it seems to have some sort of other difference. It could be maybe stylistic or thematic. Um, a good example is, oh, well, we talked about the priestly one already, so I'll stick to that. So when you're reading the P source, um, especially when you get into, say, Leviticus, right, which is like the core of the thing, you get into Leviticus and you're reading all of these laws on all these rituals about, sin and impurity and the way that those affect the sanctuary, and like what is it that constitutes a problem for the sanctuary, right? Like how do you get rid of these things, right? What does it mean to be pure or impure? What does it mean to be holy or profane? And there are very clear definitions built in there, right? That which is holy is that which belongs to the sphere of the sacred, and if it's not holy, it can't be holy unless it's sanctified. Um, and things that are impure or cause impurity um, are like natural everyday occurrences like death and pregnancy and menstruation and diseases, and like these are totally normal things and it's totally fine. And impurities, they sort of contaminate the tabernacle and make it dirty, and sin, unintentional sins do as well, and then you clean it up with your sacrifice. Totally coherent system. And then suddenly you get to the second half of Leviticus, like chapter 17, 18 onwards. And suddenly they're talking about like, well, having sex with a menstruating woman is not only impurifying, but like is forbidden. You're like, wait, hold on, that wasn't forbidden before. Um, and suddenly there's a whole range of behaviors, uh, like various interpersonal uh, offenses, be them sexual or otherwise, that that suddenly cause an impurity, not of the tabernacle, not of the sanctuary, but of the land. You're like, wait, hold on, that's a new. So you can see that this secondary layer of the priestly source is expanding on the concepts introduced in the earlier layer. It's sort of like it's like, yes, that's all, everything that the original priestly layer said is true, but also here's some more stuff. And that kind of thing, again, it's a little harder to say for absolute certain. It's not as cut and dried as a separation between sources, but often, I think scholars are pretty well agreed that what we've got at the second half of Leviticus is an expansion of what we have in the first half of Leviticus, um, assuming it, building on it, expanding it, both practically and theologically. And so, I mean, the whole second half of Leviticus we tend to call like the holiness code or the holiness document or the holiness layer um, of the priestly source, because it says things like, you shall be holy because I, your God, am holy. It's like, if you read the first half of Leviticus, you'd be like, you could, like, regular Israelites can't possibly be holy. What is this thing talking about? But again, it's like it's taken the idea of holiness from the first half, and it's been like, yes, and.
What are the textual issues of Genesis 37:18 to 36?
That's a very particular question, but I know where you get it from. So Genesis 37, the first chapter of the Joseph story, the sale of Joseph into Egypt. And you wouldn't necessarily, reading that chapter from the first part of it, think like, oh, there's anything screwy here necessarily. But then you get to the moment where they decide they're gonna sell Joseph into slavery, or sell him to these uh, passing traders, and you end up with this very weird thing that happens where they put Joseph in a pit, and then they go and sit and have a meal, and then uh, some they see some Ishmaelites wandering by, and they're like, "Hey, instead of like killing him, let's sell him to these Ishmaelites and like make ourselves a buck while we're at it." And it's like, and then they agreed to do so, and then the next sentence is like, and then some Midianites came by and pulled Joseph out of the pit. You're like, wait, Midianites? They were going to sell him to Ishmaelites. The Midianites came and pulled him out of the pit, and then it says, and then they sold him to the Ishmaelites, who brought him to Egypt. You're like, okay, well, there's like too many people involved. And at the end of the chapter, it's like, so the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt. You're like, there's too many people involved here. Something screwy has happened here. It's a really wonderful example of a place where, um, like readers have gone to great lengths to try and sort of explain this, starting with the medieval rabbi. Like Rashi was like, sure, all these people were here, right? The brothers, right? The brothers, so the Midianites, or so the Ishmaelites, so like like as if like there's this big chain of sales of Joseph all the way through. Or people say, well, Midianites and Ishmaelites, same thing. Well, I bet the Midianites and Ishmaelites wouldn't think so. Um, so you've got this text with a story that like just you can't actually, right? Like if you tried filming it, I use this as a thing all the time. Like when we read, we can like create things in our mind. But if you tried putting this on film, you'd have a lot of trouble, because you'd be like, there's the brothers, there's Joseph in a pit, there's Ishmaelites walking by, and there's the Midianites over here suddenly who are pulling him out of a pit, and they are later sending him to Egypt, but the brothers still selling to the Ishmaelites, and like that's the crux of the issue. Um, and as is often the case with just about all of the stories like this in the Torah that have these kinds of problems, it all resolves itself if you recognize that Genesis 37 isn't one story; it's two stories. Right? That is, there's two tellings of how Joseph got to Egypt. They both involve the brothers, but in one of them, they're like, "We're going to kill him." That's their plan. They're just going to kill him. They're going to kill him right there, and then they see the Ishmaelites, and they're like, "Hold on, let's sell him," and they do. That's basically the end, that story. The other story, they're going to put him into a pit and leave him there to die. but Reuben's gonna like go back and save them and save him when his brothers aren't looking. Uh, but while they're like, they put him in the pit and then they wander off, and then some Midianites come by and they like take him from the pit they left him in, and then Reuben goes back and he's like, hold on, the kid's not here anymore, right? Um, which is also, by the way, like the kid's not here anymore is another thing that like doesn't make sense in the combined story, because like we just agreed to sell him to the, like, you were there. Like we know where we sold him to the Ishmaelites. What do you mean where'd the kid go? So again, like two stories about basically the same idea, which is Joseph getting to Egypt, but not the same story, right? One, I mean, again, the brothers wanted to kill him in both. But then if you go back in the chapter, it's like, oh, there's actually two rationales for them wanting to kill him also. And then, all these doublets move throughout the whole chapter, leaving us with two like perfectly good stories that read perfectly well. Like, and this is like this. Another good example, because this is it illustrates the point that when you got these complicated chapters that don't seem to read right, and then you split it up into two stories, not only do you solve all the problems, but you end up with two stories that don't have any of the problems in them. They don't have any gaps, and you don't even have to like add a word, remove a word, or change the order of anything. Like the two stories are right there in the chapter in their correct order with all of their words. You don't have to fill in any blanks. You don't have to delete stuff. It's like, and like that, you shouldn't be able to do that, right? That's so I say all the time, people are like, oh, well, it's like that's a party trick. But I'm like pretty sure you could pick up like, I don't know, a chapter of Anna Karenina and be like, I can get two perfect stories out of this. That's not a thing. This kind of only works if it is like the real thing that happened.
And what is the deal with Numbers 11?
What is the deal with Numbers 11? Same idea. Um, you know, uh, you know, the thing I'm describing that I just described in Genesis 37, which is like two stories that have been smushed together in a single chapter. Um, it's not that that's the rule in the Torah, but it is certainly like it happens often enough. Um, in Numbers 11 is another example. Uh, this one's a pretty straightforward one, actually, for most readers who aren't even looking for it. You read this Numbers 11, you're like, boy, there's something weird going on here. There seem to be two completely different things going on. But Numbers 11 begins with the people being all complaining that they're hungry in the wilderness, right? We don't have any meat to eat. Oh, we wish we had meat. Um, okay. So then there's like, Moses is like, oh man, where am I going to get meat for all of these people? Um, and then, there's a solution to it. It's like, oh, sure, I'm gonna give them quails to eat. Um, and like and then there's going to be like a plague that follows the quails because the people were being annoying, because they always are. And then sometime at some point in the middle of there, it's like also like let's get 70 elders together and they can essentially get the spirit of God on them and prophesy, and thereby like lift some of Moses' burden of leading the people. And there's a whole story about that, right? Like where the elders who go out to the camp, and then there's the two elders, Eldad and Medad, who like stay in the camp, and Joshua's like, well, these guys are prophesying. And Moses is like, cool, that's what I wanted. And like when they're talking about the prophetic prophesying elders, there's no mention of meat. And when they're talking about the people who like are hungry for meat, there's no mention of prophesying elders. And you can really it's that chapter is like almost effortless to do because the two stories are actually so distinct, which may make us wonder, like, well, why did anybody take these two totally distinct stories and put them together? But I think they're both sort of stories about like what was the first challenge that they encountered upon leaving Sinai, right? Because they leave in Numbers 10 and this is Numbers 11. But what's the first thing they ran into? It's like this is what they ran into. They ran into like Moses needed help leading, and the people were being a pain about meat, and those two things had to go together. But the actual stories don't.
And can you tell us about your analysis of number 16 regarding the revolt in the wilderness?
Sure. Same basic idea, except here, at least the two stories that are interwoven are two stories about sort of a rebellion, but they're not the same rebellion. They're not by the same people. They're not against the same people, and they're not for the same reason. And again, this one is relatively easy, at least to see the basic outlines of, because the characters are different. So what you've got like introduced to us in the first line are all the people. Korach, this guy who's of the priestly descent, sort of Aaron's cousin, and he gathers to himself 250 guys to challenge Moses and Aaron's sort of priestly leadership. Right? How come you guys are the ones who get to do sacrifices? How come you guys are the ones who get to get close to the deity? And Datan and Aviram, two random guys from the tribe of Reuben. Uh, and the story begins with Korach, as I said, being like, "Hey, Moses and Aaron, how come you guys think you're so cool? You're the only ones who get to do this stuff. Like, we should get to do this stuff too." And Moses is like, "What are you? You're crazy? Like, fine. Like, we'll have a test. We'll have a test to see who God likes, and who God thinks should be a priest. So like, go get some incense in your fire pans. Come back in the morning, and we'll all bring incense. We'll see what happens." And then Moses calls for Datan and Aviram, who are like, "No, we're not going to come. You, Moses, are a bad leader. We don't trust you." It's like, okay, so that feels like a completely different complaint. And how come Datan and Aviram weren't with Korach when they were all supposed to be like part of the same group, in theory, at least according to the beginning of the story? And then, again, it all kind of like these two stories sort of wind their way through. So the Korach story happens exactly as you'd expect. Korach and all of his people come around to the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, and they bring their incense. It's going to be bad. Hold that story for a second, because then Datan and Aviram just said, "We're not going to come to you, Moses." So Moses is like, "Okay, I'm going to go to you." And Moses goes to their tents. Again, confusing, because why are Datan and Aviram in their tents rather than with Korach and his group, where they're supposed to be? When Moses goes to their tents, doesn't mean he leaves the test that's going on back at the tabernacle. Well, it doesn't make any sense. And Moses goes to their tents. He's like, "All right, like, you guys don't trust me. You guys don't think I'm actually like the prophet I say I am. Fine. Here's what I'm going to do. If something crazy happens to, like, right now, then I must be a prophet, because like I'm calling for a sign, and if a sign happen. And if not, then like you're right, and I'm a faker." And then the earth opens up, and it swallows Datan and Aviram and all their households. Terrific. And then a fire comes forth and consumes all the people offering incense. And like, there's just so clearly there's two different things going on here, right? So there's a complaint by Datan and Aviram just against Moses, saying, "We don't think that you like really are a prophet that you say you are. We think that you're like a charlatan who's been leading us into the wilderness for personal gain." And Moses is like, "I promise that's not the case, but now you're going to die for thinking so." And then there's Korach and his group, who are like, "We don't think that Aaron should be the only guy who can offer sacrifices." And they try to bring their own. Like, we know what happens to people who try to bring sacrifices doesn't work, because like we already had Aaron's kids, Nadab and Abihu, back in Leviticus 10, who tried to do this, and they got swallowed by fire from the sanctuary, from God. That's exactly what happens to these guys. And so that's the end of that story. It's two rebellions against the leadership of Israel, but one is all about priests and Aaron, and the other one is entirely about prophets and Moses. And in fact, those two stories, those two rebellions, match really well with the main concerns of the priestly narrative, which is the Aaron Levites who gets to be offering sacrifices, one, and the story, which has from sort of from Exodus on really been about like Moses and his prophetic leadership, and like that's what is about. Like, that's what P is about in its way. So it's not just that these are two stories sort of randomly thrown together. Again, it demonstrates that like everybody sort of knew that the wilderness was a time of rebellion against Israel's leadership, but what that rebellion looked like is different depending on who's telling the story and the kinds of emphases that they want to bring out.
What are the literary issues with the Exodus narrative?
It's a pretty broad question. What are the literary issues of the Exodus here? Where to start? Um, there's truly where to start. That's a hard one. There are like multiple going all the way back, go all the way to Exodus 1. There's multiple ideas of when Israel multiplies. When does it become big enough to be a nation? There are multiple stories about how the Pharaoh tries to control or eliminate Israel. Right? We don't think about this one because we're used to the big story, but uh, enslaving all of the people and trying to kill all of the first all of the male children don't really go together. So conceptually, right? Like, um, if you want slaves, you know, get yourself some slaves, but like probably for more than just one generation. You want to kill them? I'll just kill them. So there's multiple stories there. Moses has a father-in-law with two names, right? He's Reuel in one chapter, he's Jethro in another, and those both those names come back again later. Um, Moses' call narrative in Exodus 3, there are definitely two things going on in there. It's totally repetitive. Um, and the constructions are different. First, you go to the Israelites, then you go to Pharaoh. Or first, you go to Pharaoh, then you go to the Israelites. What do you say to them? Do you say, God sent me? Do you say, God appeared to me? Um, uh, then there's uh, then there's a third one, right? Next is 6, right? Where God again introduces himself and is like, hey, you know, I was known to the patriarchs as El Shaddai, but you can call me the Tetragrammaton, call me Adonai. Um, and that's confusing because like we already knew that from 3 chapters earlier. What we think of as the plagues narrative in chapters 7 through 10 of Exodus. The plagues are weird, man. Like that doesn't work. Um, you can start with the blood plague, and you can see that it's just that one is clearly two blood stories, right? What's supposed to turn to blood? Is it the Nile, or is it every drop of water in all of Egypt? Does it last, or is it instantaneous so that the magicians can repeat the trick? Um, Throughout the plagues, there are doublets like that. There are contradictions. Um, so you've got two plague stories going on. And that lasts all the way through Exodus 12, where you get the Passover stuff. Um, Two stories going on there. The crossing of the sea, Exodus 14, two stories. That's like another one of my favorite chapters to split up into two, because if you try reading the Exodus 14 splitting the sea story the way that it's written in the Torah, that doesn't work. You find yourself like not knowing why anything's happening or where anybody is. Um, and Moses ends up like standing there with his arms outstretched over the sea like all night long while nothing happens. It's very confusing. But it's two stories, and they're not the same, right? They're probably not the same body of water. There's not the same method of crossing. It's all sorts of different things going on. Um, Exodus 16 has got two stories of the Israelites getting manna. Uh, uh, and then you get into the Sinai material, which isn't all Sinai material, right? Somebody thinks that mountain is called Horeb. Um, like that's E thinks it's Horeb, and J and P think it's Sinai, and D thinks it's Horeb. That story doesn't work either. It's like three different distinct like appearances of God on the mountain. Moses goes up and down and up and down and down and up, and like he can't be in all these places at one time. Uh, what's he getting on the mountain? Is he getting laws? Is he getting a blueprint? Is he getting told to get out of here? Uh, Multiple different versions there. Uh, and then you're pretty much smooth sailing from then on, because you get like this whole chapters 25 through 31, you get the whole construction of the tabernacle, and 35 through 40 you get the construction of the tabernacle, and that's all P. And then chapter 32 you get the golden calf, and that's all E. But it's a mess, man. The Exodus story is a mess. uh I mean, I would have read the whole book of Exodus in one, like nearly in one breath, but like you know we're we're used to these stories, right? The Exodus story is familiar, and everyone in Israel, ancient Israel, would have known the Exodus story in one form or another too. But it's the details. It's the small details. That's you know the who, what, when, where, how, and why. That like, yeah, okay, everyone knows Israel was in Egypt. Everyone knows Moses took them out of there, or was the one who led them out of there. Everyone knows that there was some appearance of God on the mountain in the wilderness where something happened. Outside of that, everyone's telling that story pretty differently.
Can you tell us about the profusion of desperate? Let me reread that. Can you tell us about the profusion of disparate narrative elements of chapter 35 of Genesis?
Chapter 35 of Genesis. Um, yeah. So chapter 35 is a funny one because um, it's one of these that like it doesn't look so bad when you're reading it on its own. Um, like you wouldn't necessarily pick up chapter 35 and be like, something screwy is going on here. But if you've read up to that point, you recognize that there's actually elements of that chapter that belong pretty clearly uh, to other stories that have been going along. So it begins by saying like with God saying like to Jacob, okay, go to Bethel and build an altar there to the God who appeared to you when you were fleeing from your brother Esau. Okay, so like now I know that this part I just read is connected with the story of Jacob and Esau back in Genesis 27, right? Esau says he's going to kill him, and Jacob has to run away, and to parts of chapter 28 where Jacob is at Bethel, um, um, and so we've got that, and then you've got a few verses later in verse 9, right? You have God appearing to Jacob when he's arriving from Padan Aram. Padan Aram is one of these one of these key terms for where in Aram Jacob was. According to the J source, he was in a place called Haran, um, and according to P, he's in Padan Aram. Okay, so now I know verse 9 because it said he's coming from Padan Aram. Okay, I must be reading the priestly story now, but that's not the story that we had back in Genesis 27 of Jacob and Esau fighting. In P, Jacob and Esau get along perfectly fine. There's no conflict between them at all. So I had him running away at the beginning of the chapter. That's J. I have him coming from Padan Aram here. That's P. And then there's more obviously priestly stuff in the verses that follow. Right? In verse 11, God says to him, I am El Shaddai. Right? I actually just mentioned it. Right? In Exodus 6, P has God introducing himself to Moses and saying, I used to be known to patriarchs as El Shaddai. So here's that. So this is P. Um, and then you've got the story of of Rachel dying in childbirth later in the chapter, um, which is which can't be from P because in P all of Jacob's children are born in Padan Aram, and it can't be from J because in J Rachel is still alive in Genesis 37 when Joseph has his dream about the sun and the moon and the stars. Um, bowing down to him. And even his brothers and father are like, what do you think? Like your mom and dad and brothers are all going to bow down to you? Like mom, so she's still alive in J in Genesis 37. She's already given birth to all her kids back in Padan Aram in P. So this is from E. Anyway, you've got like, this is a chapter where, again, it helps. Like if you follow the threads throughout, you can see all the like little details that um, differentiate source from source in Genesis 35.
Did these sources, as they were written over time, use the earlier text? In other words, did some of these sources know the other sources in the documentary hypothesis?
Yes, yes, although in a relatively limited fashion. Um, so the one place where it's for sure this is true is Deuteronomy absolutely knows the J and E sources, which is why back earlier in the conversation I said, well, D is probably from the mid 7th century and J and E are before that, right? Because D clearly knows. How do I know that? Well, sometimes Deuteronomy, uh, as it's, the first few chapters of Deuteronomy, the first 11 chapters or so, much of it is a retelling of what happened to Israel between Sinai, um, or between leaving Egypt and their arrival in Moab, which is where Deuteronomy takes place. So it's rehashing stuff we know. So when Deuteronomy does that rehashing, it sometimes does like verbatim, word for word quotes of stuff we had from earlier. But it changes it a little, right? Which is how we know that it knows the earlier stuff, but isn't the same as the earlier stuff. So, for example, Deuteronomy comes along to tell the story of um, about Moses appointing judges, which is a story we know from Exodus 18. And in Exodus 18, right, it's Jethro, Moses' father-in-law. It's like, hey, I got a great idea. Why don't you like appoint some judges to help you with all this? And then D comes and tells the story. He says, and Moses says, remember back when we were first leaving, and we appointed judges. So like a lot of the language is literally is verbatim, word for word, phrase for phrase. It's clear that D is reading Exodus 18, but it's clear that D is not the same author as Exodus 18 because Jethro's nowhere in there, right? Moses is like, I did this. This was entirely me, which is a very Deuteronomy thing to do, right? When D retells these stories, it often makes Moses more of the main character than maybe he even was back in the earlier versions. So I know that Deuteronomy knows E. And the same way, I know Deuteronomy knows J because Deuteronomy retells the spies story from Exodus, from Numbers 13 and 14. This is an even better example because in Numbers 13 and 14, you have two spy stories, one from J and one from P that have been interwoven. But when Deuteronomy tells the story, it only tells stuff from the J version, right? Like the whole P story is there at all, which is amazing, right? That like so either the author of Deuteronomy was like a better source critic than I am, and like could read Numbers 13, 14 and be like, I can see there's two stories here. Let me just choose one of them, or which is obviously the more likely thing, or Deuteronomy had no idea that there was a P and was simply reading J all on its own. And the final piece of that puzzle is uh, when Deuteronomy comes to tell the story of the encounter with God at the mountain in the wilderness, right, the Sinai Horeb material, right, it really, really closely follows the E story, like really close. Again, lots of word for word stuff and like the same order of events and like all the same elements. But in that part of Exodus 19, 19, 20, 24, 32, 33, all of those parts, um, what you've got there, what you have in Exodus is a combination of J and E. But D only tells the E parts, which again means that D wasn't reading J and E in some combined, like J and E weren't combined when D got them. D was reading independent J and E sources. But that's the only place, and I shouldn't say that. I'll make it a tiny bit more complicated, right? Uh, J doesn't know E, J doesn't know anybody. E doesn't know anybody. D knows J and E, and P doesn't know anybody in its earliest part. But we talked earlier on about this H layer of P, this later layer, this is like the second half of Leviticus. That later layer of P, I think, is responding in part at least to some stuff in Deuteronomy. But as a general rule, they didn't know each other as a general. And it's important to keep in mind because it reminds us that like these sources, these documents, like weren't all Torah back then, right? Like there wasn't like somebody wrote J and they're like, oh, all of Israel has a Torah. Everything we write now has to respond to our Torah, J, right? Uh, P didn't need to know anything about J didn't know anything about P, and etc. They were just texts, right? They were just texts that happened to be out there.
When was the final redaction of the Torah that brought these sources together?
Yeah. Uh, so we have to go on some like slightly circumstantial evidence here, as if all of this isn't circumstantial. But uh, you know, the question is, when do we see signs that when do we see signs outside of the Torah itself that the Torah existed? What would we even look for? Well, we would look for we'd look for references to stories in or parts of the Torah that are that show a combination of these sources, these elements. Um, we might so we might look for recognition of the contradictions within the text. We might look for references to the story or retellings of the story that cross source lines. Um, and those signs, those indications, really only start showing up in the very last, chronologically last books of the Bible, which is to say, Chronicles. When Chronicles comes to tell, it's like retell the history. It begins at creation and goes all the way through, really briefly in the first 9 chapters or so. But it's clearly reading something like our canonical Torah in the way that it's telling the story. Um, Ezra and Nehemiah refer to the Torah. We've got in Nehemiah 8, you have Ezra reading the Torah to the people, and the people are like, first of all, the people act like they've never heard such a thing before. Right? They're like, what is this crazy thing that we're hearing? This new law that we've got here. And part of that law is like, the first thing they react to is like, oh my God, it's Sukkot. We should all be like celebrating Sukkot. And then they go and celebrate Sukkot, but in a way that draws on elements from Deuteronomy and from like Leviticus and Numbers. So they seem to be reading a combined Torah. And my favorite example of all is in 2 Chronicles 35 near the end, where Josiah is supposed to offer the Passover, and like clearly the author of Chronicles wants to do it like in the most legit way possible. Problem is, Deuteronomy tells us that you have to boil the Passover offering, and Exodus tells us, P tells us that you absolutely can't boil it; you have to roast it in fire. And so, what does the chronicler do when he's writing this part? He says Josiah offered the Passover sacrifice. How? He boiled it in fire according to the law. Right. So he's like, you can see him. He's like, I'll take that word, I'll take that idea from there, and this idea from here, and I'll combine them. Like, you can see him grappling with the existence of a Torah that has contradictions in it. All of that to say, it's probably like late 5th, maybe even early 4th century BCE before the Torah comes into existence as we know it, which I think is often like complicated, confusing for people who are used to the Torah being the oldest and earliest and first, not only because of where it sits in the Bible canonically, but also like its importance. But as a document, as a text, the Torah is really probably among the later texts in the entire Hebrew Bible, even if its sources are earlier.
And my last question, what is different about the renewed documentary hypothesis from that of Julius Wellhausen's view of the documentary hypothesis?
Yeah, so Wellhausen was like the great, not innovator. He didn't make any of it up. He was really good at it, but he was sort of the great popularizer of the documentary hypothesis in the second half of the 19th century, the late 19th century. And no theory is stagnant for 150 years, um, uh, and it's gone through some ups and downs, vicissitudes over time. It's been popular and unpopular. Um, People have tried to build on it in various ways. What we're doing today, and what we tend to now call these days the neo-documentary hypothesis, um, it's not so different in terms of its results. We still have 4 sources: JEPD, the redactor, but we're trying to make it a little bit clearer in terms of its method and a little less complicated in terms of its results. As back in the late 19th century, and certainly for a lot of the 20th century, people got really hung up on like style and language and word choice. Like that was the way that you identified sources. Oh, it says this word, therefore it must be from J. And that is dumb because nobody's reading the Torah and being like, the problem is it uses different words. The problem is the story doesn't make sense. And so the solution that we have is entirely sort of story plot driven. And when you do it just based on like words and phrases, you end up with like really weird, awkward divisions. And um, uh, so that's one element. Another one is, Wellhausen and many people since really working with this sort of like romantic German evolutionary scheme. Like first there was J, that was represented all of Israelite religion, and then there was E, and that was the next set, and then there, etc. And we're really keen now on the idea that we're not talking about four sources that sort of represent the like in lockstep uniform development of all of Israel's religious thought or historical imaginings, but rather that what the sources are representations of the variety of beliefs and ideas that probably existed in Israel at the same time, probably for a long time. As there's, the same way that every religion has multiple sort of varieties that are coexisting simultaneously. So too, the religion of ancient Israel, and the sources are a good reminder of that.
And so, in other words, what you're saying is that the current view kind of simplifies Julius's former view, and that these traditions can represent independent thought in different parts of Israel, and not necessarily one uniform thought.
Yeah. I mean, there's, you sort of sense in that earlier view, like this like romantic notion of like, the culture is developing, right? But I mean, part of what that was for him was like, so for Wellhausen, is culture developing, but also culture like, going down the sewer, right? For him, the earlier stuff was this like wonderful, what he thought Jay was earliest. It's like, it's family stuff. It's like earthy. It's very down to right real life kinds of ideas. God appears in person and talks to people. And the latest stuff for him was the priestly. And it wasn't late like, oh, like the religion developed so nicely. It was late like, look what bad things happened over time as like we edge towards Judaism, right? Because he saw, I mean, sense correctly, that the priestly material in the Torah looks more like Judaism as he understood it. It also looked more with, like priests and intermediaries, rituals. It looked a lot like Catholicism to him. And so as a Protestant, he was like, that's the bad stuff, right? So the whole religion was like, all of ancient Israelite religion sort of moved in lockstep from like good, sort of like prophetic, natural, close to the deity. In other words, looked a lot like Protestantism. Like that's where it started. That was its origins, its core. And then over time, the Jews kind of ruined it and drove it towards this, like, this religion of rituals and rules and no access to the deity and priests taking over, and that looked like Catholicism. So that's a scheme that probably none of us should really want to be supporting anymore, because it's Orientalist and anti-Semitic and like all kinds of terrible things. So instead of thinking that way, since like I said at the beginning, right, you can't really date these for the most part, like either relatively or like or objectively or absolutely, because they were these are texts that existed over a long time, which is to say parts of Israelite culture, whether it was priestly groups or northern groups or prophetic groups or southern groups or whoever it was, right, parts of Israelite culture were maintaining these texts as like important documents to them over generations and decades and centuries, which is to say they must have all existed at the same time, right? Even for them all to brought together into one document means that at that point they were all extant, right? Some parts of Israelite society were reading them all. And so, yeah, like, isn't that more true to life in a sense, right? That, in ancient Israel, there would have been different ways of telling the same story in the same way that in America, I use this example all the time, the same way that in America, somebody from New Hampshire and someone from Alabama are going to tell the story of like the Civil War differently. At this, like even today, hundreds of years later, like they'll agree on the basic facts, but like not how to tell the story, not where the emphases are, not what it meant, not who was right necessarily. Right? Those are all points of dispute, and so too for ancient Israel as they were telling their sort of mythic past.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Professor Joel Baden.
My pleasure.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.